I'm a geographer, actually, and my interest in place and space has always been mediated through literature. So through the stories that places have in them or that people tell about them. So whenever I encounter a new place, I've always felt the need to get at it or to understand it or to explore it through literature as much as through the physical space itself. And although I was born in Toronto, I spent a lot of my young life and early adult life outside the city. And when I returned as an adult, it was as a stranger in many respects. And the first thing I did was I got into fiction that had been published recently. So Anne Michael's Fugitive Pieces and other works published in the 1990s. And it was from that reading period that the Imagining Toronto project actually emerged, the sense that there were a lot more stories about the city than were generally recognized. Now, my sense that literature is a good way to get to know a place or to understand a place actually has, I'm not the only one who thinks this, famous Toronto novelist Michael Ondaatje, his one Toronto novel, In the Skin of a Lion, he says, it's a city-building novel, incidentally. Most people have heard of it, if not actually read it, about the building of the Bloor Viaduct and the R.C. Harris water filtration plant, that beautiful Art Deco structure on the waterfront in the East End. But Ondaatje makes a very interesting observation early in The Skin of a Lion. He says, before the real city could be seen, it had to be imagined, the way rumors and tall tales were a kind of charting. So this sense that the real city, however you can map it, it doesn't have a real corporeal existence until it has stories about it. And Ondaatje, in many ways, is echoing travel writer, essayist Jonathan Raban, who in his very well-known 1970s book, Soft City, wrote, "The city as we imagine it, the soft city of illusion, of myth, of aspiration, of nightmare, is as real and maybe more real than the hard city we can locate on maps." So when I talk to people about Toronto literature, whether they're undergraduate students or urbanists or architects, I say, well, we have different ways of interpreting the city. We have demographics, we have economic policy documents, all of that kind of stuff, GIS tools, geoinformatics, but those are texts for one thing. They are different narratives of place. Literature, to me, it's a more direct narrative. It's a text like any other text, like a work of economics or a demographic report or census data or anything of that nature. Now, Imagining Toronto, or the Imagining Toronto project, has always had, of course, a series of motivations or motives that have driven it. One was this notion that Sean has pointed out, that often people will say, well, Toronto has no literature. There's no story set here. There's no movie set here. Those are all set in other more important cities. I mean, Bloomsday was last week, so we all think of James Joyce's Ireland. We think of other cities. We think of films set in New York, for example. We don't have any King Kongs on our Empire State Building here. Nothing, the CN Tower, nothing exciting happens to it, right? But that's not true, of course. There are plenty of fictional works, novels, poetry, collections, plays, what have you, that are engaged with the city, and of course the CN Tower, which often gets knocked down in literature. And the import of that is something for another talk. But so part of my motivation has always been to say there is this literature. This is a very important part of understanding and living in our city. But another part of it is to deal with what literary scholar Germaine Workington calls this kind of perplexing cultural amnesia that Toronto suffers from. And in a very interesting essay on the imagined city and this amnesia, she attributes this to a kind of city-building compulsion that's destroyed and rebuilt the city's monuments and its myths in some kind of competition for what we think of these days as world-class stature. So to become a real city, we have to tear things down. We have to always be in the process of building. So there's this notion of this amnesia, which has a role, incidentally, in a very important Toronto book Gwendolyn McEwen was a Toronto poet, very well known in the 60s, 70s, and 80s until her death. She has a book called No Man's Land. If you're interested in Toronto at all, I would definitely pick up. And No Man's Land has this protagonist, this central character. His name's No Man. He has no name. He's an amnesiac. He has no memory, much like the city itself. And at the beginning of No Man's Land, he emerges lost and naked in the wilderness in central Ontario, and he hitchhikes to Toronto, the city without an identity or a memory, to search for his own. And in No Man's Land, he goes through all of these. He kind of retraces elements in Toronto history that we remember or sometimes forget. Marilyn Bell's swim across Lake Ontario. No Man claims he spent some time inside the Henry Moore Archer in Nathan Phillips Square. He visits Honest Ed's, of course, which you should all do before it closes and is replaced by condominiums. But there's this effort to diagnose and then deal with amnesia. And I think that's a very central part of Toronto's problem. The reasons why we have amnesia, as I've suggested, it might be the city building compulsion, as War Kenton mentions. When I talk about culture and multiculturalism and diversity, I also, I've kind of inferred that part of that amnesia comes from the reality that we come from so many places and we have so many different histories. And as I've said to people often, we lack a shared history. I mean, who cares about the War of 1812? I ask my students this every year. Have you been down to Fort York? Were you celebrating, the great invasion of Toronto in 1813? And they all look at me blankly. And I say, why not? And that's because their histories are in Sri Lanka and Nigeria and other places with much more recent, interesting histories in certain ways. So we don't have this shared history. We may lack a common cultural language as well. So Imagining Toronto has sought in many ways to kind of bridge this a little bit, to say we have a literature, what's this literature talking about? So now, please be my friend, technology. Anyone seen this film? 1948 film called The Naked City. It's a great film. You can watch it on YouTube. I notice it's up right now. Often they take it down for copyright reasons, but it was up again today. It's a very important film, city film, kind of pseudo-documentary narrative, so it's fictional but told in a documentary style. And it's a film in some ways about a murder, and it's a police procedural and a kind of crime thriller genre that has become very familiar, but in 1948 it was very new. This black and white, stark film that begins you're in a plane flying over the island of Manhattan, and there's this sense of descent into the city, so from high up into the city itself. And there's this voice-over, which is a very important part of the film itself, and I can't adopt a New York accent, unfortunately, so just imagine that part. But it's at the very beginning of the film if you view it yourself, and the narrator says, we're flying over an island, a city, a particular city. And this is the story of a number of people and a story also of the city itself. And he talks about the actors playing out their roles on the streets, in the apartment houses, in the skyscrapers of New York itself. And he says, this is the city as it is, hot summer pavements, the children at play, the buildings in their naked stone. So the role of the city as a character, as a protagonist, is really crucial to the film The Naked City. And so after this, what has become in many ways a standard-seeming police procedural, at the very end of the film, there's a sense of drawing back from the streets, back up and outward from the city, and the narrator intones, it's 1 o'clock in the morning again, and this is the city, and these are the lights. And then he says, there are 8 million stories in the naked city, and this has been one of them. So this notion of the naked city is kind of where I want to really begin, all right? And the Naked City has a kind of interesting history. It was this film in 1948. Shortly thereafter, it spawned a television series called The Naked City, which borrows as its byline. You can see there are 8 million stories in the naked city. So it was a late 50s, early 60s television series that took many of the same cinematic approaches and storytelling perspectives in this notion of the city. But where does Naked City come from? Weegee. Anyone heard of Weegee? Anyone interested in photographic history? Weegee, his real name was Arthur Fellig. He was a New York photographer, came to prominence in the 30s, but particularly in the 40s, and he was called Weegee. It's a misspelling of Ouija as in Ouija board, and he was a candid street photographer. He took pictures of just street scenes, people, lovers in parks, soldiers going off, cleaners, car accidents, murders, that kind of stuff. And he had a kind of sixth sense, an uncanny ability to anticipate stuff happening on the streets. And he described it as this feeling he would have, this almost this smell of the city, that there was a frisson in the air. And he would go out, hunt it down, and often he would be at the scene before the police or the emergency services. So he was a kind of an intimate voyeur, this life, recording life at street level as it was. And he published a number of books of his photographs. One of the best known is called Naked City, that name again, published in 1945, and it's very much worth taking a look at. So we continue this notion of Naked City. Now, this is one of Fellig or Ouija's well-known photographs. It's an image, it's panned a little bit, and this is important. At the bottom, there's a dead body, and there's police, the investigators, the detectives, all that kind of stuff. But the important part of this photograph is the people staring out the windows in the apartments and the tenements above, the crowds in the background. So the story here, the real show, is the show of the people who are doing the watching. They're immersed in the event. They're part of the city. This is the way a city lives and the way a city dies. This is the naked city. Okay, so this is the narrative city. All right. Now, how we theorize this, incidentally, there's a number of ways of theorizing it, and these days, I try to steer clear a little bit of, excessive theorizing scholarship in public talks, just because then we get into debates over one ideological, intellectual approach versus another. But I wanted to invoke Michel de Certeau, who's his book, The Practice of Everyday Life, has really become very prominent in the geography and the social sciences in thinking about how space is inhabited and lived, resisted. He, along with, say, Henri Lefebvre, his book, The Production of Space, David Harvey in geography have really transformed how we think about space in the contemporary era, kind of Marxist influenced, very much a focus on contemporary capitalism, relations of production and consumption and reproduction, and how those shape the spaces we inhabit. So in the practice of everyday life, there's a chapter called Walking in the City, and Michel de Certeau opens it by describing standing at the top of the then still standing World Trade Center, looking down at Manhattan below him, and the sense of the starkness of it, the emptiness of it, the structure, the shape of the city with none of its content. And there's this tension, of course, between the panoptic, Jeremy Bentham's panopticon prison, this ordered space, regulated, controlled, and the lived or embodied or corporeal city. And that's a tension that de Certeau plays with very much, and that I see very much in urban literature. So I've just got a few quotations. I hope you don't mind that I'm a very text-focused person, so I think in terms of quotations. So here's, to be lifted to the summit of the World Trade Center is to be lifted out of the city's grasp. So you leave behind the mass, your Icarus flying above. The elevation transforms you into a voyeur. And it's way beyond the scope of conversation today to talk about the problematics of the voyeur and who's a subject and who's an object, and intersubjectivity and all that kind of stuff, but maybe for questions afterward. But there's this tension. There's a utility, of course, to being at the level, the summit of the World Trade Center. This is the position that planners and designers and politicians and economists tend to operate from. Big picture. I mean, I was an urban planner for almost 10 years, and that was the life I lived, of policy, of long-term. But at the same time, I found it kind of stultifying because I could never put a joke in an official plan amendment or a zoning bylaw update. It always had to be big and long and proscriptive. there's a utility to that, but it also has its limitations. And so de Certa goes on, and this is really the focus of the Walking in the City chapter, and in fact, the whole practice of everyday life. He talks about the ordinary practitioners of the city who live down below the thresholds at which visibility begins. He talks a lot about walking, the long poem of Walking, the city, and he talks about these urban texts, uses language of music and musicology, as well as kind of, poetics a little bit, to describe a narrative that is crafted, the possibility of resistance of, say, the orderly production and consumption-focused city. He describes, at one point, the tactical resistance to this totalizing, regulated version of space that we tend to inherit in cities, the idea of the city as a total entity. These tensions between the formal and the informal city, rational, ordered, produced spaces, the know-when, a flattening out of space, the false notion of a universal and autonomous subject, and so forth. And one of the things he's arguing for and against at the same time, I always find there's a dialectic, as it were, in de Certa, is this notion of the death of the city as concept that he talks about. There's an obvious interface with, say, Henri Lefebvre, lived spaces, represented spaces and spaces of representation. Is there wiggle room for more spaces of representation, more active civic engagement, but maybe for another time. So where do these stories begin? What's, where does narrative happen? How is it meaningful? He talks about pedestrian speech acts at one point and where the story begins. The story begins at ground level. This is something that literary scholars who focus on cities often talk about life at street level. For example, Sidney Bremer, literary scholar writing about American cities. They begin with footsteps. They're myriad. They don't compose a series. And he talks about how we move through city spaces in practice. We take steps forward, we change our mind, and it's almost like a dance or a choreography of sorts. And the way de Certa describes the city and the city narrative is actually how writing itself occurs. So if you're reading a novel, it's a good novel is almost never a straight linear sequence. It's things that happen, and the coherence emerges from them and sometimes despite them. It's not linear, it's not, when you're reading a novel, you don't have the panoptic view. You're not supposed to. If you do, what's the point of reading a novel? You can read the Coles Notes, which I suppose a lot of undergrad students do. All right. The swarming mass of city walkers, people who are crafting the stories of the city, they have these intertwined paths that give shape to spaces, and they weave places together. Okay, so that's kind of the long overture, I suppose, to talking about particular narratives in Toronto. I wanted one more naked city that connects a little bit to this idea of the long poem of Walking, de Certa's everyday life. This is, of course, a very famous map of the naked city, borrowing deliberately from Ouija as well as the film The Naked City. This is produced by Guy Debord and his group of situationists who were, kind of radical, kind of drunk, hoping to revision, resist the productive, consumptive city. This is a map of Paris, meant in part to represent their ways of remapping it, their kind of psychogeography of Paris, but at the same time to represent some of the emptiness of formal planning. There's a whole, dialectic again of how the naked city can be read. But again, it's the impossibility of a truly coherent map. All right. So the idea that a good map is a good psychogeographic map is disorienting. You are disoriented because your normal orientation is one of production and consumption. So it's a map that's against coherence, against capitalism, in some readings, against consumption. It's for the rupturing of the urban order. And why rupture? Rupture can be for ideological purposes, so to break capitalism in some readings of the Situationist work. But it can also be by breaking something open, we can see its parts, we can envision new ways for it to work, but at least we can see the individual stories that craft these collective versions of what a city is. Now, when we're talking about Toronto, one thing that stands out is people say Toronto doesn't have a mythos. And in fact, This is something that pseudo-philosopher Mark Kingwell has written about in an essay called I'll Show. It was in a book called Toronto, A City Becoming. And I thought it was a very interesting essay because he was striving in a kind of totalizing way for what Toronto is. How do you get at this process, this ongoing process of Toronto? It's always emerging, the city. And he says it's not a city in a modern sense of a unified whole. And of course, I always think of LA in a sense because it's very similar in that respect. But he says Toronto is a linked series of towns held loosely together by the gravitational force of the downtown core. There's a physical center, but there's no normative or mythic one, and no single agora or narrative of Toronto. And I actually think that he's half right here, and half wrong, of course. He's right in the sense that Toronto doesn't have an easy center. We tried to build these centers like Yonge Dundas Square or Nathan Phillips Square in the 1960s. We might think of St. Clair or Spadina for me or Yonge Street for other people as these kind of spines of Toronto, but really Toronto doesn't have an important normative center, and you see this in the literature. But to me, that is our mythic core. We have these kind of what I call creation myths about what Toronto is. You know, we used to talk about Toronto the Good, for example, this notion that goes back to the 19th century. It was a mayoral campaign when it was coined. Hogtown, we'll talk about Hogtown in a few minutes. But we have these are attempts at myth. The myth of Toronto being the most multicultural city in the world, which is a large focus of my work. Why do we have this fervent belief in multiculturalism for all its problems? What does that say about us in Toronto? Well, we also have this idea that we are the city of neighborhoods. And we are the city of neighborhoods. They replace in some ways this notion of a core, of a center. I think that those are a lot of Toronto's strengths. You know, I've been doing some reading lately, the last year or two, on ethnic enclaves, which are so easily and often criticized as, you know, failure, evidence of the failure of multiculturalism, say. But there's great work. Mohammed Kadir, one of my old supervisors at Queen's, still, you know, carrying on doing work on how ethnic enclaves shift over time. They're not ossified places. Like culture, they change. And they're a kind of neighborhood as well, or neighborhoods within, or, you know, layered upon, atop of neighborhoods. So Toronto is the city of neighborhoods. I mean, St. Clair is a series of neighborhoods, and I'll end up talking more about one. But this idea of the city of neighborhoods is kind of long-standing in narratives of Toronto. Hugh Garner, novelist of fame, and the short story writer and novelist of fame in the 50s, 60s, until his death of complications of alcoholism in the 1970s, describes Toronto as a score of cities joined together by geographical propinquity. There's this song from this 1960s satire folk group called the Brothers-in-Law, and in their song Toronto the Good, they say Toronto is this place where an antique administration drags on, like a bunch of small villages rolled into one. And if you dealt with community councils, which you have and I have, it seems awfully familiar. Stephen March describes Toronto as a city where the streets proceed tiresomely through the neighborhoods in which each house tries to be more ordinary than the next. So this kind of forelock tugging, little heads down, that parallels the self-aggrandizing notion of, you know, Toronto, the world-class city. And finally, Margaret Atwood, I always love this. She likes to poke holes in our little balloons, and she describes that despite how Toronto sees itself as changing, there's this old city lined street after street with thick red brick houses with their porch pillars, like the off-white stems of toadstools, and their watchful, calculating windows, malicious, grudging, vindictive, implacable. So this is the city of neighborhoods, a city that defines itself by separations in many ways. I mean, in my neighborhood, I live in the Junction, so travel to the west of the streetcar where it ends at Guns Loop and walk south. And just ignore the lingering traces of the meatpacking plants and you're in the Junction, which, when I first came there, was never called the Junction. It's now hipster, trendy Junction, but at the time it was called High Park North by real estate agents or Bloor West North by real estate agents. It would never be called the Junction because it was shameful. a shameful place in Toronto to live. But now, of course, it's hipster and probably shameful in another way. I should grow a beard, right? And then I'll fit right in again. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about one part of St. Clair. When I was putting together this presentation, and I've had a long time to think about it, I was thinking, St. Clair, there's so many literary references, so many things I could talk about. The Italian history, Corso Italia, novelist Frank Pacey's work. He's got this series of novels tracing they're semi-autobiographical, tracing his movement from Northern Ontario to Toronto and his kind of coming of age, and they're fantastic. Or the Forest Hill version of St. Clair being part of that crossing, and a delineation in some ways. There's lots of Forest Hill fiction, some of it Jewish, some of it very Anglo-Saxon. I thought, well, I could talk a little bit about that. The private school novels, there's a whole bunch of those. I thought I could do a little bit of environmental kind of St. Clair West, Aaron Murray's fantastic book of poems, Sheep's Vigil by a Fervent Person. If you're interested in the buried streams that make their way across St. Clair, as I was biking here, of course, I was damming every ravine and every uphill slope, and of course the headwind that was pushing me back home. But those are, the beginnings of that long slide down to the contemporary lake bed. But there's many different St. Clairs. Of course, it's a number of different neighborhoods. But I thought in the end that I would focus on one. There's been a lot of talk about work and labor in St. Clair's transformation. So I thought I would talk about the very West End a little bit, the meat packing area, Carlton Village, Earl's Court, Junction a little bit. It's fantastic history, so labor history, urban history. Richard Harris's work, for example, on early suburbanizing movements in Toronto in the very West End, for example. But the literature of St. Clair at the very West End Junction is kind of being overlooked. It's not, big fancy books that are taken as emblematic of Toronto. How much time do we have, by the way? Are we okay? Am I running out? Okay, so I'll be really fast. I'll talk fast. But there's a number of works. One is Judy Coburn's novel, The Shacklands. And if you're interested in this intersection of Toronto's labor history and kind of urban-suburban edge growth, poverty, immigration, this is definitely the novel for you. It's really an excellent, well-researched book. There's actually a lot of novels that deal with Toronto's labor history, many in the garment trade because that's where some of the most interesting history is. Also, the bridge building, city building, Michael Ondaatje style, or the Austin Clark living in the interstices of the city, the domestic laborers, the maintenance workers. I mean, there's a lot of labor histories of Toronto. But Judy Coburn's The Shacklands really unifies place and class very well in this depiction of this intersection, the spatial where the junction ends, so St. Clair, Keele, east, say, to where Prospect Cemetery is, and so Carlton Village, Earl's Court Village, that area. And in the early 20th century, sorry, getting my centuries mixed up, it was an area of an immigrant intake area, so Toronto had the ward, which was where a lot of Italians, blacks, and Jews lived before the Jews moved north and westward to Kensington Market. There was Cabbagetown, a little bit east of downtown, that Hugh Garner described so famously as North America's largest Anglo-Saxon slum. But it wasn't the only Anglo-Saxon slum, as it were, in Toronto. The Shacklands was another one, this immigrant intake area. People who worked in the junctions, they worked a little bit for the rails, they worked in the meat packing areas, they worked in the garment industry, so they would travel by the streetcar toward Spadina. And Coburn has very good depictions of this neighborhood at the time. The small black roofs, the darkness, the crossroads, no human illumination marked this country road. So imagine Prospect Cemetery and a little bit westward, and this kind of self-built, run-down shack area, the wrong side of the tracks in the most literal of ways. And in her novel, there's this young woman, Jessie, whose mother dies shortly after arriving in Canada. She's left the oldest daughter to look after the younger children. She has to leave school, although she's a very promising scholar, look after the children, and eventually find work in the garment industry in Toronto. There's, of course, some labor uprisings, the beginnings of union-style movements in this industry in which she's involved that are told very powerfully, or evocatively at least, in Coburn's novel. But you get the sense of transformation of the Shacklands. They're building their own homes, they're building their own identities, they're kind of claiming this part of Toronto, even though they are outsiders in social and economic ways. Okay. And this isn't necessarily Shacklands. This is Lauren Harris's painting, January Thaw, Edge of Town. But whenever I see it, I always think of the depictions of the Shacklands. And in fact, it does look like this sometimes at the end of the winter. So the higgledy-piggledy houses built on hill slopes, snow melting all around. There's no architectural uniformity, which is considered so characteristic of Toronto. In fact, that when you are on a street, say south of College Street, in the area around Runnymede Road, north of St. Clair, and you see houses that don't line up, that don't look the same, and yet were probably built prior to World War I, chances are they are these immigrant, self-built suburbs of that period. All right. Now, moving forward to just after the Second World War, we have this notion St. Clair changes in the junction with meat packing, the rails, and so forth. This is a novel called Hogs and Cabagers. I like it because of its depiction of Cabbagetown, Toronto in the 1950s, very working class again. And its protagonist hitchhikes to Toronto with somebody with a truck of hogs, and they arrive at St. Clair and Keele Street. And their arrival, their first visit to Hogtown, is heralded by a horrific stench, a stench that even overwhelmed the occasional whiff of our squealing cargo of hogs. What on earth is that odor? That's the smell of money, my good friend. That's the big CP. CP? I asked. Yep, CP. That's Canada Packers, lads. Biggest goddamn meat packer in all of Canada. You're smelling the start of some damn fine eating. Makes you want to grab a pork chop, dripping in fat, don't it? Laughed Archie. And it goes on in that kind of vein of the very visceral introduction. And I've seen this in a number of fictional representations of the Junction area or this St. Clair Keele area. Is always the smell, the smell, the smell. Of course, the smell is still there. There's still a little bit of meat packing just off Guns Road, and we'll get to that in a minute. All right, and then the kind of a little bit of Hogtown. You want me to stop, right? Can I have about 2 more minutes? Okay. I thought it was going to be short. Then I ramble. All right. So we got Hogtown and Cabagers, but we think of the Junction. We think of Earl's Court, St. Clair as having gentrified very greatly. The streetcar being part of that gentrification, not causing it. Bidding wars in my neighborhood all the time, but it's not fully gentrified. There's still very run-down areas. Kristen Dunyon's is a collection of stories called The Dirt Chronicles. She has this story set in a squat that's adjacent to one of the meat packers that still remains just off Guns Loop, so west of West End Road, north of St. Clair, and the sense of the smell and this contrast, this rejection of the gentrifying, upwardly mobile bidding war infused neighborhood to say, well, this other St. Clair West, this other junction, this other Carlton Village still exists beside it. And of course there's that hotel whose name always escapes me at the corner of St. Clair and Weston that has a jerk chicken place in it. It's always perpetually kind of a rundown rooming house kind of place, although it's on the market I think for $9 million right now or something like that if you want to reinvent it. But I guess kind of to finish off narratives, what narratives do people who actually live in the area have? It's not all gentrification, hipster, bearded junction. A lot of the folks I encounter, they work at what they call the chicken place, which is one of the meatpacking plants adjacent to all of those big box megaplex there. And their story of that area, that life, is very different from the kind of upwardly mobile junction we've come to encounter. So basically what I wanted to do is introduce the idea that understanding a city through its stories is very important, and that in Toronto in particular, looking at neighborhood as narrative, is a way of getting away from the city as a whole, looking at its atomized parts and how those kind of work together. You can have analyses maybe based on class, maybe based on race if we're talking about culture and multiculturalism and so forth.